We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
And welcome to a special post-by-election episode of Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined by two colleagues, John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Ben Borland, who's the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. Well. In a result that has, I think, confounded all the doubters, proved them wrong, Labour managed to beat the SNP in the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election. Davy Russell is the new MSP for the constituency. So before we mull over what was a pretty incredible win for Labour, let's just listen to the result.
Ross Lambie, Reform UK, 7,088. Katie Loughton, Scottish National Party, 7,957. Davy Russell, Scottish Labour Party, 8,559. And I declare that Davy Russell is elected to serve in the Scottish Parliament as a member for the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse.
Congratulations to Davy Russell. What do you think about that then?
It's a surprise, that's for sure. I think I'll hold my hands up. I sat in this very chair a week ago and predicted that Labour would be third and Reform would run the SNP close. I don't think I was alone in that prediction, though, which is one consolation. And also the SNP were run very close by Reform UK. But ultimately, as far as all the pundits go, and the bookmakers, it's a shock win for Labour. It's and a vindication, I think, of the candidate that they chose in Davy Russell. He was criticised as the invisible man, but clearly he was still a popular guy in the constituency. He was well known, he was trusted, and it just shows that local politics can still trump national politics.
I mean, I was there at the count in Hamilton, and the boxes came in, they were counted, there was rumours flying, and then I can't remember what time it was at, but you could see the body language in the Labour folk and the SNP folk, and I just detected a sort of nervous energy within the Labour camp. Not a negative energy, but just this feeling like they sensed that it was on, that it was doable, and then on the SNP side, a sense of dread that it was slipping away from them, and that's how it basically materialised in the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge win for Labour, there's no doubt about that. The party have been saying this, they've proved that pundits wrong. It has to be said, I think a lot of us pundits were taking our lead from people who were speaking to within the party over the last few months who weren't, I think it's fair to say, weren't as confident that this win would come. It does look like it's been a tactical victory for Anas Sarwar and Jackie Baillie, in the sense that they went for a candidate who was very well known locally. He, it's fair to say, wasn't the best performer in terms of media interviews. He famously didn't do the TV debates, but it does seem that there was, Labour were criticised for this, but it does look in the end like it's been a tactical victory. They've chosen someone who was well known in the area, and maybe that's what's made the difference here. I think Labour will be celebrating tonight, but this should be a fairly safe seat for Labour to win if they have aspirations to win the Holyrood election the next Holyrood election. So it's a huge victory, but it shows that this election that's coming up is wide open.
Just on why did they win, there's 2 points I would make. One is clearly Labour had a very effective ground operation. to put it simply, they identified where the Labour vote was and they managed to turn it out on the day, and I think they were probably successful in postal votes as well. So there's no doubt that on the ground they were far superior to the SNP and also to Reform, which was a fairly ramshackle sort of organisation in terms of the basics of a by-election campaign. But also, if you think about the SNP campaign and what John Swinney was doing, it was all very negative. It was all about how bad the Labour government is, and also accusing Reform of racism, which I think he was absolutely right to call them out on. They didn't have a positive agenda. Now, they've been in government for 18 years. They didn't seem to have any story to tell about what they'd achieved. And when they did talk about policies that they'd implemented that were popular, they're all way in the past. Talking about tuition fees and things like that. I mean, that was like Alex Salmond that did those things. They don't have a track record of success that they can point to in the last 5 years or so. It's a bit of a blank canvas, and people associate the recent past in relation to the SNP as a record of failure, and I do sense that is catching up with them.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a strange quirk of Scottish politics that you can have a party that's been in government for as long as the SNP, who also managed to fight an election campaign based on saying the government's been doing very badly. They're talking about the UK government there. Obviously, the truth is that both the SNP and the Labour government in Westminster are suffering from the same situation, aren't they? That there just isn't really much money to do eye-catching politics with at the moment. It does look like the Reform have taken a lot of votes off of the SNP as well as Labour, and I mean I'm sure we're going to go on to talk about this, but it is really one of the big stories of the night is that you had three parties, all of which potentially could have won this. It was a very, very close election.
We'll come on to Reform in a second, but Ben, I mean, John Swinney was adamant that Labour had no chance, that it was a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform. I mean, I think the First Minister's got questions to answer this morning, doesn't he?
He certainly does, yeah. I mean, it's... there's been a lot of talk about the SNP bouncing back and John Swinney being this lucky leader. I think last year we were all pretty much dead set that Labour were going to win the Holyrood election. Keir Starmer's government came in, made a spectacularly bad start to governing at Westminster, and suddenly the polls flipped and it looked as though John Swinney was going to cruise into another term in Bute's House. This morning, that's up in the air again. I think the fundamentals haven't changed. Like John said, the SNP haven't made, and like you said yourself, the SNP have no positive story to tell. They've no sort of, not even eye-catching policies. They've no competent record. They've just made a mess of most of the devolved issues.
I mean, between now and the next election, I guess they'll say, well, we've reintroduced winter fuel payments and 2-child cap as well, which I think is due to be scrapped in Scotland next April. But I suppose the question that the Scottish Government will struggle with is, what have you done for me recently or lately?
And obviously you've got the big benefit pledges, but ultimately we're talking about the NHS, we're talking about schools, we're talking about I know it's such a cliche, the state of the roads, we're talking about the feeling that crime's on the rise again, all these bread and butter devolved issues, which the SNP just have failed to get to grips with.
They wanted to talk about anything other than devolved issues in their own record.
I mean, it's very difficult.
There's only so... I mean, you can't run forever.
Yeah, I mean... I don't think any party in the history of British politics has been doing amazing after being in power as long as the SNP. That's the truth of it. But they do need to show that they're competent in government over the next year if they want to win the next Holyrood election, and they also need to come up with some policies that are clearly distinct from the ones that, as you say, were introduced by Alex Salmond over 10 years ago.
They've just lost the ability to deliver policies that make a meaningful difference to people's lives. That's the sort of challenge that they face. I interviewed John Swinney during the campaign, and he said that a reshuffle would be soonish, which I interpreted as after the by-election result and before the end of the summer recess. I would imagine that will be foremost in his thoughts. He'll want a refresh, maybe sideline or move sideways the cabinet secretaries who are not standing again, give some of the rising stars a higher profile. But they've been in for so long, and people will just inevitably think, what have they done for us? Isn't it time for a change? And I think that this is a moment of danger for the SNP.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what my prediction would be that John Swinney is going to have a laser focus on competence over the next year. I think he accepts that really he doesn't have the wherewithal to deliver big new policies. I think that anything that's going to be in any way controversial or viewed as identity politics is going to be dumped, and the big focus is going to be on trying to appear competent, to get NHS waiting times down, to, as you said, fix the roads, give people a bit of confidence in that their kids are going to get a good education in school, and just try to return to some semblance of good, competent government. I think that's all he can do really over the next year.
I don't think you can't do that in 11 months. I mean, they've not done it for the past. I mean, let's say we're talking about the Salmond era. They delivered some sort of competent government as well as these big ticket policies, but they haven't been a functioning, competent government, I would say, for about 10 years. I think the last Holyrood election came during COVID, so it's almost put an asterisk next to it and say the reason the SNP won a convincing victory was because of COVID, because of the pandemic, because of this perception, which we now know to be, falling apart, that Nicola Sturgeon was keeping us safe. I think actually there haven't been a functioning, competent, decent government for years and years and years. And
their vote share is down massively compared to 2021 in that particular constituency.
True, although I noticed that the vote share for Labour in the equivalent Westminster constituency was much, much higher last July. So it does show that Labour have, while they'll be cock-a-hoop and they'll be delighted, and I mean, to be honest, I'm delighted. I just want to see whoever beats the SNP beat the SNP. So, but they are down on last year, so there's still work for Labour.
So we have to talk about reform, because let's face it, 26% of the vote was a very good result for them, and they weren't that far behind the SNP, and they weren't that far behind Labour. In the end, it seems like they're now a permanent fixture in Scottish politics. Yeah,
I mean, the big story today is obviously Labour's victory, but I think underlying that, really, what is going to have a bigger impact is just this realisation that the reform thing is happening. If you look at the vote share and you consider the fact that the Holyrood election has this, you've got a proportional representation element to it. You've got three parties now who will all feel like they have a chance of winning next year. I think by the time we get to that election, reform won't. I mean, the campaign in this by-election was a bit half-hearted, wasn't it? I don't think they ever believed that they could actually win it. In the end, they've come third, but really they were a fraction behind both Labour and the SNP. So this is a seismic change in Scottish politics that we're looking at here. They seem to have almost eradicated the Conservatives, but they're also taking loads of votes off of both Labour and the SNP. Hamilton could be viewed as a bit of a bellwether for certainly central Scotland. And if this vote was replicated across the country, then there's going to be huge changes in the Scottish Parliament next year. And I guess one of the big questions now is, if we end up with a totally hung Parliament, as this result would suggest, is there any chance that Labour and the SNP are going to have to finally accept that they're going to need to work together to some degree in order to keep reform out?
Ben, just looking at some of the numbers, so the gap between Davy Russell and Ross Lambie in third place was about 1,500 votes. Now, that's in the context of Labour having a very good ground operation, having voter ID, knowing which doors to chap, having a postal vote strategy. Reform didn't have any of that infrastructure, and they came within 1,500 votes of Labour in first place. And you have to, being honest, if Reform had had the level of information that the SNP and Labour had, if they had that postal vote strategy, they could have won that.
They could, I think they could. I think, though, and the Express came out and urged our readers to vote Reform because we kind of believed the polls, we believed the predictions that they were the closest challengers to the SNP. In event, obviously Labour hung on. So I think there's a tactical voting element. I think there's a kind of coalition that's coming together behind Reform. On the one hand, you've got anyone but the SNP. And if you're in a constituency, if you're in Hamilton and you're a Conservative voter or you're a Lib Dem voter, do you vote for Labour? Do you hold your nose and vote for Labour, or do you hold your nose and vote for Reform? You vote for the party that you think is going to stand the best chance of beating the SNP. It's a long-established feature of Scottish politics that tactical voting takes place all over the country. Pro-UK, anti-independence, tactical voting, and Reform needs to fit into that, and the other parties need to make room for Reform within that. I still think in the northeast, in the borders, in South Ayrshire, the Tories are still the closest party, so people are going to flock behind them. It's where do Reform fit into that tactical voting strategy.
Also, as well, see if you compare the results this morning to 2021. People who voted SNP a few years ago must have voted Reform.
That's the other part of this Reform coalition. The SNP have always relied on this kind of magical thinking that just becoming an independent country will make everything better. And Reform have the same sort of, the two sides of the same sort of populist coin. There's a similar amount of magical thinking that Nigel will just make everything better.
So why did you encourage your readers to vote for a magical thinking party in order to keep out another magical thinking party?
Because ultimately it comes down to who beats the SNP. Who beats the SNP and who's the best place to beat the SNP? Because I think most of our readers, like me, think that they have been awful for Scotland and we just want them out. So, obviously you wouldn't vote for just anyone, but Reform seem to offer a good chance of beating them. I still think next year the Tories will be there or thereabouts in third place. I think Reform will...
I think they're the dodos of Scottish politics. The Conservatives are.
Yeah, but in
6%.
But that's in South Lanarkshire. If you're in a Conservative area, the tactical voting strategy is still vote Conservative.
I think in Aberdeenshire, that's where Reform are probably strongest, and historically that's where the Tory core vote has been. Obviously, the borders and the south of Scotland as well. But if I was a Tory, I'd be very worried about that result.
I think the thing for Reform, is there's a decision for Nigel Farage to make. Like John said earlier, do the SNP and Labour work together? Farage has said he'd put the SNP back in. rather than support a Labour Scottish government.
Was it not a bit more subtle than that? It wasn't quite as explicit as I will put the SNP, and I thought there was a bit of spin attached to it.
I think as well, obviously, that was a message to his voters in England who were like, oh, what are you going to do a deal with Labour? I think if push came to shove, the 4 pro-UK parties would back Anna Sarwar for First Minister. However, does that then damage reform? Because clearly they are getting lots of voters from the SNP who do support independence, who, perhaps that Farage's sort of equivocation on the referendum question and the independence question allows Scottish nationalist supporters to vote reform.
There's a flexibility in Reform's constitutional position that you don't see with the Conservatives. We'll look ahead to the next Holyrood election. I mean, I think Scottish Labour have been very poor over the last 6 months. John Swinney has bossed the narrative, but that seems to have completely changed with this by-election result, and I'm wondering if this is a turning point for Anna Sarwar. And it does seem like from this point onwards it's game on for Labour. That maybe finally they've got the momentum back.
I think that Labour had to. I mean, this result looks very good for them this morning. Cast your mind back 4 or 5 months, and this result people might have been saying, well, really Labour should have been winning this by quite a bit more, because this needs to be a safe seat for Labour, really, doesn't it, for them to win the Holyrood election. So it's a good result, but the party has a load of work to do. But I guess what this shows is that it's there to be won. The problem is that's exactly what the SNP are going to be thinking, and it's exactly what Reform are going to be thinking. And so the question is, what's the direction of travel? And I think that's probably what Labour and the SNP are going to be a bit worried about today. They're both parties who, in their respective parliaments, are in power. It's going to be a difficult year for the country financially and all the rest of it. Reform have got a lot of momentum behind them now. I personally think it's on the back of quite a poisonous agenda. It's about immigration, isn't it, at its core? It would appear that their own chairman has come to this realisation and quit a couple of days ago. So Reform have got a lot of momentum. They're offering simple solutions to complex problems. They're offering I think at its core, quite a hateful agenda, but it's going to be a big problem for both Labour and the SNP to fight that off and try to regain the momentum.
One thing that I think is in Labour's favour for next year is that you look at this by-election result, and on first past the post, Reform managed to win over 25% of the vote. I don't think they will do nearly as well on first past the post next year. I think most of their votes will come in on the list, because I think that many Reform voters will vote tactically on first past the post to punish the government that they dislike the most. So, I would expect Reform to win maybe over 10 MSPs, but I'm not convinced that they're going to do massive damage to Labour next year. So, as we speak right now, it looks like we've got a very competitive Holyrood election in our hands.
Absolutely. I would just sort of, I wasn't a fan of the Reform campaign video with Anna Sarwar. I thought that was a mistake. I think the party does make errors, but I just would take issue. I just don't think it's hateful to be concerned about immigration. I just don't think it is. I think...
But the campaign video wasn't really an error, was it? It spoke to who the party is.
I don't think it does. I don't think it does. I think... we're talking about...
They didn't back down from
No, they
the
didn't.
video, they said, we stand by it. That's...
I mean, are you saying a third of voters in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse are hateful and kind of attracted to racist politics? I just don't think it's... I think immigration is a massive concern, and it's been too high, and the Prime Minister recognises that.
Well, I mean,
a Labour Prime Minister recognises that open-door immigration has been a mistake.
I don't think concerns about immigration make someone racist, and I think it's a legitimate thing to put into the public domain. But if you look at that advert that they put out on Sarwar, it wasn't about immigration. It was about questioning his Scottishness and sort of suggesting that he was only going to appeal to one community, which was a completely baseless claim. So that wasn't about stopping the boats or having a legal and regulated system of immigration. It was just a personal attack on a politician.
It was, and it probably, I mean, it might have cost him a win. Who knows? It could have actually backfired and cost them the win in the by-election. I think, again, we were speaking about this a couple of weeks ago. I'm not convinced there was that much thought went into it. I think it was probably just someone in the team put this together, and Farage realised this is getting me headlines. There's no such thing as bad publicity. I'm going to lean into it and play it at the press conference. On the one hand, I didn't think it was a very nice video. I didn't think these kind of attacks...
To put it mildly.
I don't think these kind of personal attacks are very good. On the other hand, I don't think it was quite as vile as some people made it out to be.
And one final thought. I mean, clearly the turning point in the campaign was the Daily Record's front page, Graham Souness endorsing Labour. We all get behind that. Is that the consensus?
What I mean, as a Man United supporter, I would be reluctant to do what the former Liverpool captain tells me to do, but yeah, if Suey says it, then it's all right by me.
All right, great. Well, what a moment in Scottish politics. That was a crazy by-election and a pretty incredible result as well. So thanks again to John and to Ben. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.